It's a cliche. Those who forget the past are doomed to repeat it. But I don't think history repeats itself. But when you have similar circumstances and similar factors, human beings are going to react in similar ways.
Welcome to LatinX Can, a podcast showcasing Latinx professionals who turn their dreams into realities. I'm your host, la doctora Jenire Flores Delgado, and today I'm here with Dr. Luis Martinez-Fernandez, a professor of history who experienced life events that demonstrated the fragility of democracy itself and who now is committed to protecting it. And he is here to tell you, sí se puede, my friends, sí se puede. Dr. Luis Martinez-Fernandez, welcome to LatinX Can.
Thank you, Jenny. It's a pleasure and an honor to be in your program.
Oh, I'm excited to have you, and I think this is going to be a very informative conversation. So let's start by talking about your story and where your story begins.
Well, how much time do we have? That would be
about an hour.
Yeah. Well, I've been fortunate that I've had an opportunity to live in many different places, go through exciting and in some cases dramatic experiences from an early age. I was born in Cuba in 1960. That was the second year of the revolution when so many things happened. So by 1962, my parents decided that it was a good time to leave Cuba, given what was transpiring, largely the collapse of, and I'm not going to say democracy, because some people believe that democracy ended in Cuba with the ascent to power of Fidel Castro and the rebels, but that's not true. Democracy had collapsed before as a result of the military coup in 1952. So from there, we briefly stopped in Miami, as so many thousands of Cubans were doing in that year. And then we went to Lima, Peru, where my father worked for the same company that he had been working in Cuba. And so I grew up in Peru like any other Peruvian kid, a fan of soccer. My favorite team was Alianza Lima, which was almost an all-black team. It's interesting that, the most popular team was El Universitario, La U. But I sort of consider it as an elitist team. Okay. So I always rooted for the other team, Alianza Lima. Then in 1970, we're back in the Caribbean, this time in Puerto Rico. I had a wonderful education there, not just in school, but at the University of Puerto Rico, where I had the great experience of working with some of the brightest minds in terms of the historical discipline. And then another migration. In 1986, I came to the U.S. to pursue a doctorate with the hope of going back to Puerto Rico and teaching at the university. But things didn't work out that way, I should say. So I've been here ever since. And honestly, I consider myself to be so fortunate to be able to make a living doing what I love doing, which is history, connecting the past with the present, publishing, and disseminating that knowledge through any means possible, including your program.
Yeah, I mean, we're so honored to have you here, and it's a wealth of just information, knowledge that you can share with our audience. And as I'm listening to your story, it seems like you and your family sort of follow the sea in every way, right? You went from Cuba to Miami, from Miami to Lima, I had the pleasure to visit Lima last August, and I found it so fascinating, so beautiful, and yet so different from like the Caribbean beaches that I'm used to, right? Yes, but it was amazing. It was so lovely.
It's very cold from what I remember. And yes, you're right. I've lived close to the shoreline most of my life until I came to this country, but I lived in close proximity to the ocean. And, that's part of who I am. And
Yeah.
I'm sure it has a lot to do with some of the fields of study that I've pursued, international relations, international trade, the Caribbean being a hub, a historical hub of production beginning in the 1500s.
Yeah, for sure. And you mentioned that when you then moved to Puerto Rico and lived in Puerto Rico, grew up like a Puerto Riqueño, and graduated from the University of Puerto Rico with a Bachelor's of Arts and a Master's of Arts in History. And when we first talked, you mentioned that you became a historian because you wanted to understand your life story. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, that was definitely part of it. For some reason, history holds a special place even in our society, which is so material, so based on the things that are practical. And yet our society still has a space for history. And I'm convinced that in our evolution and the way our brains were wired, it was important to know what happened before, if for nothing else, just to avoid the same mistakes. And I'm convinced that many of us love history and are attracted to that discipline for those reasons. And yes, if you're born in a country and 2 years later there's a revolution and then you become an exile, actually a refugee, and then you go to another country and 8 years later there's a military coup and you have to migrate again. So largely, I was trying to make sense of all these experiences. Why was I different? Well, I was different because I had these different experiences, and that shapes you.
For sure. And I think when we talk about diversity, that's exactly what we mean, right? We don't just mean to have people that look different in pictures or in places or in groups, right? The reason why diversity has value is because we all had different life experiences and we can bring those different perspectives to the table.
Yes. I've actually today, I was listening to a very well-crafted presentation we were having here at UCF, an event put together by African-American faculty and staff. And the person started with this beautiful image. Actually, it's a quote from an African-American woman politician. And it was, if there's no space at the table, bring a fold-out chair. And I thought that was beautifully put.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the other way to look at it is if you find your space at the table, spread out your elbows and make a little room for somebody else, right? That can bring a different perspective.
Yes, if we don't do that, and actually I've been involved in national boards and places where fortunately big decisions are made. And my mantra has always been, who is missing at the table? So it could be a Hispanic, it could be African American, it could be young people, it could be senior citizens, it could be people with disabilities. Each perspective enriches whatever we're discussing or wherever we're working on. And by the way, sometimes within our group, Hispanics, Latinos, we enter these fights and we bite each other's heads because you said Hispanic and not Latino, and you say LatinX. Sometimes we limit ourselves because we engage in these, I would call smaller fights, and we don't work together to do what precisely you said. You are the wedge and you have an entrance into an organization. Well, bring others with you.
Yeah, I don't know how to address those issues because so now the term Latinx is getting banned in different states and some people don't identify as Hispanics. And for me, the reason why I use the term Latinx is because it's inclusive and I want to be inclusive of everybody and I don't want to leave people left behind. And so does it mean that I'm married to the term Latinx? No. And whenever there is a new term that's better and more inclusive, I'll be happy to adopt it. That's not the fight I'm fighting. The fight I'm fighting is for us to recognize the things that we have in common while celebrating our diversity, right? We are different. We're not all a monolith. We understand that. But at some point in our lives, we all ate rice and beans, and most of us like it. So if we figure out that we can find things in common and then united, we can get together and have a more weight into shaping society, shaping politics in this country. I think that's where we should focus our energy while still celebrating how different we are at the same time.
I agree 100% with that.
And so we were talking about your different stages of migration or the different places where you and your family migrated. And you mentioned then in 1986, you made that conscious decision yourself to leave Puerto Rico, which is also part of the United States, but now come to the continental U.S. and then pursue your PhD at Duke University in history as well. What was your experience like when you moved to North Carolina and you this time made that conscious decision to migrate?
It's interesting because I was in a conversation a few years ago and somebody said, well, we shouldn't use the term migration because we're coming from the same country to another part of the country. Mm-hmm. I disagreed then because leaving a Spanish-speaking Latino culture as Puerto Rico is and moving to North Carolina, where I went to get my PhD, it's not like moving from Georgia to South Carolina. It's definitely not the same thing. It is a migration. It takes adjustment. And what you do is you learn. I mean, one of the positive things about emigrating and getting my PhD in the United States was that my education had been in Puerto Rico. It had started with very narrow focus on the history of Puerto Rico. When I came to Duke University, I worked with specialists on Colombia, Peru, Mexico, and that opened my eyes to the fact that, yes, we're an island in the Caribbean, but it's part of something much larger. It's part of the Atlantic world. It's part of Latin America. And if you don't understand that wider connections and relationships, then you're not going to understand your country. Now, the other thing is that once you leave your country, then you gain a comparative perspective because things are different. That's why some of the works that I've used in my own research are travelers' accounts, particularly North American and British travelers who went to Cuba in the 19th century. Well, guess what? They write about things that for everybody else on the island, which just matter of fact, nothing to write home about. But for them, because they had that comparative perspective, they started writing and have left very valuable information.
Yeah. And Puerto Rico is really also a unique place in that it was colonized by the Spaniards like the rest of Latin America, right? And then eventually through battles, and I don't know the history, so you probably can shine more light into it, it ended up in the hands of the United States, right? And so it just makes it different and unique.
Yes, actually, if I may plug a book by an author that I admire greatly, his name is Jose Luis Gonzalez. He wrote a book entitled Puerto Rico, the Four-Storied Country, Puerto Rico, el país de los cuatro pisos. And he builds the history of Puerto Rico from the ground up. And the last chapter or the last story is actually Puerto Rico under the United States, late 20th century. There is a lot of influence, of course, of U.S. influence on the island. But, anybody who knows Puerto Rico knows that it is a Hispanic society. Of course, in the case of Puerto Rico, the indigenous population, which was sizable before the Europeans, it was decimated. So 90% of them died or were killed, mostly by diseases. And then, of course, you have a strong African component beginning in the 1500s. And then that makes Puerto Rico, like other places of encounter, very interesting places. It is in places of encounter that cultures come together. So you have New York City. Well, guess what? You have all these immigrants from Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, and that's where salsa begins. Take another fascinating place of encounter, New Orleans, so rich in the different cultural components. Well, guess what comes out of it? Jazz. So it is in those places of encounter, usually port cities, that you find that enormous creativity.
Yeah. And we were talking, right, about your movements around the regions when you and your family were migrating, and it was driven by these major events that eroded democracy in those countries, right? And many decades later, we are witnessing similar events. Peru is in turmoil right now. Brazil experienced an attack on its Congress a few months ago. Even in the US, we experienced an attempted coup d'etat on January 6, 2020. As a historian, though, you talk about that relationship between such events, like the different political turmoils that we're seeing in the world today, and the state of democracy in the US and across the world. Can you talk to us a little bit more about that?
Yes, we're going to get a chance later to talk a little bit about my book, which is actually coming out this week. But the subtitle is Politics, Culture, and the Unimaginable Events of 2019-2022. Things that were previously unimaginable. An attempted coup in the United States, which has been a beacon of democracy for the rest of the world. How did we get there? And it reminds us that the United States is not immune to authoritarianism. And there have been some warning signs. And really, I love looking at different periods of history. But this really started when Obama became president. And for many people, he was illegitimate. You know, we know those false stories about him being born in some other country and being Muslim. Well, when you look back at history, you look at Abraham Lincoln, who was elected in 1960, and he too was deemed unacceptable. And actually, South Carolina, which was the first country to secede during the Civil War, actually, I think they seceded almost right away in 1860. They called it a hostile act. So the fact that somebody was elected president was deemed a hostile act. So there are many parallels, and that is why I'm a historian. It's a cliche. Those who forget the past are doomed to repeat it. But I don't think history repeats itself. But when you have similar circumstances and similar factors, human beings are going to react in similar ways.
You talk about the state of democracy in the US, and we're not immune to challenges to democracy. What is your take on where the state of democracy is in the US at the moment?
Well, democracy, and I've been saying this for a long time, is something very fragile. And unfortunately, there are people in this country who no longer believe in democracy. Just yesterday, two individuals, a man and a woman, were arrested. They were plotting to create havoc in Baltimore with the hopes of starting a racial war. You know, you're from Venezuela, I'm from Cuba. Democracy has to be taken care of.
Yeah.
In Venezuela, you know the story better than I do. You had democratic regimes for several decades.
Yeah.
And Venezuela was an inspiration. But unfortunately, many of these leaders were crooks, and they corrupted the system, and people lost faith in it. And guess what? You know, that opens the door for a demagogue like Chavez. Similar story in Cuba. Venezuela didn't learn. Cuba had a very imperfect democracy, and the democratic leaders were crooks. You know, they stole millions of dollars. And so that debilitated not just the democracy, but the desire of people to fight for democracy. That happened in 1952. The president of Cuba was Carlos Brio Socarrás. There's a coup against them, and just a few students showed up to the palace to defend them. Everybody else said, you know, why defend this? You've soiled democracy.
Yeah. I mean, I feel for just talking about the current state of politics in the US, and for me it's both a challenge and a responsibility now. But for I've been in the States for 16 years, and I left Venezuela when I was 17, so I had never voted in one election before last year. And that's because I became a citizen 2 years ago, not in enough time to register to vote in the 2020 elections. So I had to wait 2 more years until I could participate in the electoral process again, right? And so that happened for the first time last year. And for me, it's just being able to participate in this process now and just understanding how, for me, what's happening here is very similar to what has happened in Venezuela, but at opposite stages of the political spectrum, right? And we talk about the role that Latin people, Hispanic people, Latinos have in the US right now, right? So we are, by the most recent census data, 19% of the US population.
Yes.
We are the largest minority group that is also growing the fastest. And we are young people, right? By the majority of our people are young, which means that today we have already an impact in the political system. Our vote matters right now, right? And then in the future, our vote is going to matter even more. And so now talking about, these relationships that I see between Venezuela and the US with two different bombastic leaders at different ages of the political spectrum, I feel like a lot of us come to this country or have been raised by people in our families that bring all of these experiences from our own countries, right? From Cuba, from Venezuela, from Peru. And that's influencing the way that we are starting to think about politics in the US. And so I want to maybe discuss with you what your view is on that, where that comes from. And so what do we need to do to maybe just really try to understand the system here as an independent system that is not the same as the countries we come from?
Yes, those are very good questions. First, I'd like to say you mentioned that we're almost 20% of the population. But if you look at the arenas of power, and I'm talking about the media, I'm talking about corporations, I'm talking about governing boards and boards of trustees, we're virtually inexistent there. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And I would say, I don't let any other group represent us. We have to have a space at the table. Now, regarding the politics, these are different cultures. Let's face it. The United States has been from the beginning a democratic country. That's not part of the history of Latin America, where we have had caudillos, these strong men who are military leaders and stage coup d'etats. Another major difference has to do with the fact that in the United States, institutions are stronger than the leaders. In our countries, we have leaders that rise up, thinking about Perón, for example, in Argentina, or Vargas in Brazil, and many, many others in each of these countries. So these leaders become more powerful than the institutions. So the parties, for example, are stronger than the individuals. Until very recently, I will say, because what has happened since Trump became president is that he was really able to get a hold of that party, and still has a strong hold over it. Now, leaving your country is very traumatic. I mean, some people, say, well, these individuals that are crossing the border every single day, it's like a field day for them, and finally they're in America and they're going to get rich. Yeah. We know that that's not the story. We know that for every person that enters, there's a trail of suffering that sometimes goes back decades and certainly miles. It is not easy, and sometimes it can be traumatizing. People from your country, Venezuela, who lost everything they had. And of course, these dictatorships come in different political colors. You have the right-wing dictatorships like Bolsonaro, which is not really a dictatorship. He's an authoritarian leader. And then you have the leftist authoritarian leaders. If you ask me, they're the same people because they're anti-democratic. We look at the world as a spectrum from right to left, but really the left extreme and the right extreme, they behave in pretty much the same way. They have no regard for democracy. And what happens is that, people bring those traumas and, I'm going to speak about my community, Cuban American community. You escaped communist dictatorship, but then you don't realize that what led to that was, number one, and this is why history is important. Number one, a democracy that was abused by corrupt leaders. That takes us to a dictatorship by Batista, 1952 through January 1st, 1959. That was not democratic. And then you go to the Fidel Castro regime, which means you must take care of democracy. Now, if you leave Cuba, then you think that the safest and the wisest thing to do is to go to the other extreme. And I'm sorry, it's anti-democratic no matter the political coloration.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that you mentioned, right, we have to take care of democracy, but we also have to take care of each other, because in the one of the similarities that I see between Trump and Chavez, for example, is the division that they encouraged. Maybe they didn't start there. Maybe they were not the cause of the division, but they certainly encouraged us to see the other person on the other side of the ideology, to see them as enemies. And that is not at all what I think we should be doing, right? Like, we can have differences and we can think differently, but we don't have to hate each other for thinking differently.
No, and there are very deep roots. If you study the colonial history of Latin America, you understand that there were castas, and the castas were different racial groups. And actually, it was not just blacks, whites, and indigenous. The castas were literally dozens and dozens of different castas. And that was used to, dominate people, to exploit them. So those roots are there. So when you agitate, when you have a demagogue that agitates the masses, that's based on past experience.
Yeah. Okay, so we were talking about the state of democracy and how democracy really is a thing that we need to take care of. And when we talked about preparing for this call, we talked about the role of civic engagement and the importance it has to, be able to take care of democracy itself. How do you define civic engagement, and why is it important? And what are your top 3 recommendations for people to practice civic engagement?
I would start with education. You need to educate yourself. You need to read the newspapers, watch the serious news on TV. I emphasize that with my students, and I tell them, listen to NPR, read The Economist, inform yourself. Because if you don't, then you're very vulnerable to these types of demagogues that will tell you what you want to hear. So I would start right there, education. Now, education, of course, is something that is lifelong. And as a professor, I instill that value on my students. Here we have a limited amount of time in a university, but if we can become lifelong learners, you're going to be in your 60s, 70s, and even beyond that, and you are going to derive pleasure from learning. And that means, it's good to have fun and I don't listen to him, Bad Bunny and company, but you need to find good sources of information, read good literature, for example, poetry. Latin America has given the world so much in those areas. Secondly, be attentive. be attentive to any threats to democracy. And I'll explain to you what I mean by that. You know, I've worked in places, university professors, we have a lot of freedom. We have a lot of autonomy. We really don't like anybody telling us what to do. That's part of our culture. And I remember, not where I'm teaching right now, but at another university, they were counting heads just to justify, I don't know what. So everybody who walked into that building, well, not really a building, into a series of offices, they wanted you to sign a sheet of paper. And from day one, I said, no, I'm not going to sign anything because I'm not coming to see you. I'm coming to this other office. Now, you may think, well, Luis, you gave them a hard time. But, if you let them take away your freedoms and your autonomy, it starts little by little. So keep an eye on those restrictions. And then also civic engagement is not just through politics. Civil society is very important. When governments fail us, what we have left is civil society. And by that, I mean organizations like the Bar Association. I mean civic organizations, activists, community organizers. That is very important. And when that's gone, well, then the monopoly of power is in the hands of the state. And that is very dangerous. Societies where only one newspaper circulates. For goodness sake, I'm Cuban. Cuba, going back to the 1700s, had scores of newspapers. During the 1950s, we're talking hundreds of newspapers. We're talking about a large number of radio stations with news and everything else. And then what happened? All of that was consolidated by a dictatorial state that gained the monopoly over the news. That is very dangerous. So we need civic society. That's very important. Journalist organizations, which play such an important role throughout Latin America. And as you know, journalists have become targets for a long time of authoritarian regimes, that they just don't want you to shine a light on what's happening. That's very important.
You're talking about things that we need to be doing and the role of media and journalism in just keeping us informed and helping us understand what's going on. And then we keep talking about the similarities between Trump and Chavez. There was not a long time ago, maybe only a couple of years ago, when Trump started saying, oh, maybe that news channel, we should think about revoking their license, right? And that's exactly textbook of what happened in Venezuela.
That is very right. Coercion. So that's why I applaud what you're doing. You've created a space here for alternative views. Certainly, you give Latinos a microphone. That's not very common in the mainstream. I'll be honest with you. If you turn on, CNN, MSNBC, when was the last time that you saw a Latino analyst? Few and far between. So we need to, make spaces for each other.
Yeah, I think that's a common theme of what we are discussing, right? Just make sure that we have a seat at the table, create spaces, and then bring more of our people to give that point of view.
Let me tell you one thing. I'm fortunate. I don't have to be scavenging for food every day. There are many people in the Americas who have to do that in your country and in my country. So I have that taken care of. And they really can't be that enthusiastic about freedom of the press because their issue, their day-to-day issue is a roof over their heads, food on the table, basic medical care. Now, those of us who have those areas taken care of can mind these other issues that are so important to everybody. And so I'm a professor. Freedom, academic freedom is essential. I live in a state where, let me put it in these terms, where the government, the state government is coming after us. Well, I have news for you. That is a sacred freedom that I have, my academic freedom. So don't mess with that. Freedom of the press, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly. It was the French who gave us a lot of that. And then American progressives who have fought to maintain those rights that are enshrined in the Bill of Rights. I don't want to get dramatic, but these are things worth fighting for.
Yeah. And I like what you said, not everybody has the ability and the privilege to worry about things that are not our basic needs. And it's also true when we talk about advocating for diversity and inclusion and things like that in workspaces, because not everybody has the privilege of saying, I want to challenge the status quo when maybe you're a single parent, they have 3 kids at home that you have to feed, right? Yeah. So I think what's important in this message is that if we have the privilege of doing it and we can use our voice and it's something that we care about, we should totally use it. And whatever little capital we have to spend, it's worth spending.
Yes. And let me say one more thing related to this. As I said, I'm privileged. I have a PhD in history. I have a wonderful job. And I've done everything that was asked of me and more as far as being productive, as far as writing books, as far as being a world-class scholar. It sounds as if I'm bragging, but that's not the point. The point is that even with all of that, we still have to fight for a space at the table. It's not easy. It's not easy, but what is the option? You can be a victim. We're all victims in one way or another. But we can choose not to see the world as victims and to see, I'm going to fight for this. My people deserve this. They deserve respect. If you have a board of editors in a major newspaper and there's no Hispanic or Latino there, there's something wrong. And that's worth, banging on the table over that. So it's not going to come as a gift.
Yeah.
All of these are struggles that we've been fighting for generations. And we lift each other up. That's the way it's going to work.
Yeah. And one other thing that I wanted to talk about, because as part of your activities in your platforms, you talk to politicians or to party leaders about the Latino vote, because people, I think, understand that we have power, but they don't understand how to engage our community in the political system. So what do you tell people who are involved in political campaigns about how to better engage the Latinx community, the Latino community in the political system in the U.S.?
Yeah, I don't talk to them personally.
Okay.
And I really don't have an interest in doing that. That's the topic for another program. What I do is through my writings, through my columns, and whenever I have a chance, I present what's fair, We started this program with the stat that you share that we're 19% of the population. Well, where is our fair share? Don't come to our communities. And I've written this many times. Every 2 or 4 years, I call them political satellites that orbit different parts of the country. They say a couple of things in Spanish and we laugh. We're part of the problem. We think that's good. No, don't do that. If you want our vote, you need to be engaged with our community and deliver at the time of delivering the goodies. But sometimes, you've heard of Jenny Day, they say a couple of words in Spanish and we start clapping as if that was such a great accomplishment. No, speak to me clearly in whatever language.
Yeah, and I think what part of that is just believing that we deserve to be engaged, to be understood. It's for people to spend time understanding what our needs are, our desires are, and to really put work to all of those promises, the promises that they make to us, right? Because it's just about, I think part of the issue, and I see this a lot, is that we haven't realized all the power that we have and that we're going to continue having. And it's stepping into that power, I think, is important for us.
Yes. And I like to paraphrase a Puerto Rican politician, Luis Muñoz Marin, who was a true Democrat. And when he started his party, very humbly, he would go with the other leaders of the party to the most remote locations, the tiny villages, and he would speak to the people face to face. And he would tell them, lend us, that's a verb, lend us your vote. If we don't deliver, take it away because it's yours. And he was the architect of modern Puerto Rico, a true Democrat. Yes, he wasn't perfect, and we can raise a lot of criticism, but it was that principle that the vote is yours.
And Luis, when we started this conversation, we started talking about all the different events that you lived in your life before you were 10 years old, and then how those events have repeated in the recent decade that we're living right now. So all of this is part of the things that you talk about in your most recent book, right? And it's called When the World Turned Upside Down, Politics, Culture, and the Unimaginable Events of 2019 through 2022. So the book comes out this week, I think you mentioned.
It's out already, yes.
It's all out already. Tell us more about your objective with the book and what it's like.
Well, I'm a historian, so I'm trained to look at the world as a historian, to use documents, to weave narratives, and to analyze phenomena. 2.5 years ago, to use an abused term that we associate with Madonna, I reinvented myself as a writer. And I started writing regular columns. And these are opinion columns on a whole range of topics. Some deal with world geopolitical developments. Others deal with politics in the U.S. Some are cultural. And I started writing those. It's a lot of work because you have to come up with something every week.
Yeah.
But the good thing is that there's so many strange things happening in the world that I have plenty of fodder for my columns.
You've had enough content.
Oh, yes. It's not a boring time at all. So I decided to put them together as a book and organize them by chapters and different topics. And after all this time, finally, When the World Turned Upside Down is available for purchase online.
And what do you, when you say you weave these things together and you've organized it by chapters, are you following like the story of the recent history of 2019 through 2022? Or how are you organizing the book?
Yes, they cover that period, and they were all written between 2019 and 2022.
Okay.
Now, they also cover, because I'm a historian, I need to go back to the past. So I look at World War II, for example, to try to understand what's happening in Eastern Europe with the Russian attack of the Ukraine. And we look back at the past. So all of these topics. Now, when I got the idea of publishing the book, my first thought was to organize them chronologically. But as I continued to write more columns, I realized that there were certain topics that it might be better to include 6, 7, 8 columns within one unit or one section. So, for example, there's one section in which I look at the antebellum and the U.S. Civil War of the 1800s and sort of draw parallels to what has been happening in the United States. Another section is on Cuba. I have a section on Puerto Rico. I also have a section on culture. I have a section on reading. I have a section on geopolitics that includes the rise of China. I try to be very attentive to what's happening around me and then offer an analysis, tell a story. You're aware of development of Chat GPT, which is artificial intelligence that can generate all sorts of written works.
Yeah.
Guess what? You know, it could write an opinion column like I do, and it could churn it out in 20 seconds. But as I wrote in my last 2 columns on that subject, it is something devoid of humanity. There's no heart in it. But I don't think we're too far from having online newspapers that are completely generated by artificial intelligence. We're there. I think we're safe, because we have an advantage over machines at this point. We can be creative. We have feelings. We bring those feelings into what we write. So at least for the time being, I'll continue to write columns until the day they say, well, Luis, we don't need you anymore. We have this robot who's going to start writing columns. But I can tell you, they're not going to be as good.
Yeah. And so, Luis, to end up the episode on a light note, I always ask this question so that we don't have to think about the days that humanity is going to be reduced to machines. I imagine a friend of yours comes to visit you in your city, whatever city you want to choose, and they want you to show them around as a local, but unfortunately, you're not around. So what are your top 3 recommendations for people to do or places to go to visit or things to do around your city?
Well, I live in Orlando, so people know what's here in Orlando.
Yeah.
I won't talk about that.
No.
Because there are plenty of other things. We have museums. We have a wonderful science center. I took my grandson the other day. There's a Lou Gardens, which is a place where they have lots of plants and they study them scientifically. So I would say, yes, you may have to end up going to those theme parks, but there are other options which are much cheaper, and they provide you with rich experiences as well.
Oh, fantastic. Well, Luis, thank you so much for joining us in the podcast today.
Thank you. Un placer.
Igualmente. Thank you for listening. If you want to put a face to the voices you just heard, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok at LatinX Can. If you have questions or feedback, you can email us at latinxcan@gmail.com. And if you want to support our project, please leave a review. We have made it easy for you and added the links to the show notes. That's it for now. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, and remember, unidos somos más.